I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people just like you who are doing great things in the world. I just want to apologize for coming on a little late today. We're having some connection problems, so if that occurs during the broadcast, please bear with us and we will reconnect immediately. My guest today is no stranger to my audience. In fact, I think I've interviewed him more than anybody else, and if he was a fruit, he'd be watermelon because you just never get tired of him. And every time I think there's nothing else to talk about, you guys send in a bunch of amazing questions. So there always is something to talk about with him. His name is Dr. Doug Lisle. He's the co-author of The Pleasure Trap, the psychologist at both the McDougall 10-day program as well as the True North Health Center. And he has an amazing website called Esteem Dynamics where you can get a lot of free content and for less than the price of a cup of coffee, some really amazing new exclusive content as well. I just watched the new video yesterday, as a matter of fact. Please welcome back Dr. Doug Lisle. Thanks so much for coming back. I do appreciate this so much.
Oh, it's a joy, AJ. It's great.
Yeah.
Great.
You're just so fun. It's just like we really, there's always something to talk about, isn't there? You think there isn't, but there is. Starting with, let's see, some of the questions are really good, so I'm not sure what to start with, but I'll do one from last time that we didn't get to. And this is from Maria, and she says, in the Living Wisdom True North Health videos, Dr. Lisle spoke about the impact of a whole food plant-based diet on cancer, which is largely unknown. I'm wondering what Dr. Lisle thinks Dr. Campbell's work has done for the field, since I know he also speaks very highly of Dr. Campbell. Is the China study worth reading? And if so, why?
It's a lot of different questions. And I would say that the China study is absolutely worth reading. It's a great book. I would say that my opinion about what I see about the connection between diet and cancer has changed since I wrote The Pleasure Trap. And let me tell you how it has changed. Dr. Campbell's work, a lot of it that was so exciting was done in the laboratory, and it was done by using toxins to start cancers, and then see what would happen with diet, whether we had a vegan diet or an animal foods diet, and how much animal food, etc. The results were really, really interesting, super compelling. However, there's a difference between a naturally occurring cancer that we don't know the reason why it starts exactly, and a cancer that we manipulate into an organism with a known toxin. And so it turns out that the control that we were hoping was being demonstrated by those dietary changes is not as great as we thought it was. Now we don't understand all the reasons why. So now we are 20 years past that research, and I would say this about plant-based diets and cancer: they give you better odds. They're going to reduce your odds, not trivially. It's going to be probably on average, it's going to be maybe a 20% less likelihood of any given cancer. The greatest impact is probably going to be on the digestive cancers, just because that's where the more toxic food is in more direct contact with the body tissues, and therefore doing the most damage. For the same reason that cigarette smoking will cause all cancers, or not all, but vast majority of human cancers will be increased with cigarette smoking. But the biggest thing that's going to hit is the lungs, because that's where the toxic products are having the most concentrated effect. So I think that, however, it would be a mistake to think that you are bulletproof with respect to cancer just because you're eating a very healthy diet. And so that's why we still want to be smart about making use of diagnostics in modern medicine when it's indicated. So modern medicine is full of promises and not a lot of good delivery in general, but it's going to turn out that modern medicine, just like the rest of the world economy and the human adventure, makes a tiny little bit of progress every year. So just as your car is a better car in 2020 than it was in the year 2000. So I had a Camry in the year 2000. And that same Camry 20 years later is a better car. It's very similar. The car in 2000 was pretty good. In fact, it was very good, but not quite as good. In the same way that cancer treatments and cancer diagnostics have chipped away and gotten a little bit better and a little bit better. No big revolutionary advances in almost any area. But if you personally are facing cancer, you don't rule out modern medicine, and you don't put all of your faith in a natural foods diet, but you would always do the natural foods diet. You want to give your body and your odds the very best possible push that you can. So food is not magic; it's important, and so we want to we want to mute down the overconfidence that people may feel as they have heard and read the China study and heard generally things being claimed in the natural foods arena for the power of food with respect to cancer. Food has a nearly perfect record with respect to cardiovascular disease. So this is, I was speaking with Caldwell Esselstyn at one point, and he said, he was glad that even though he had been a surgeon who had performed an enormous number of cancer surgeries, when it came to doing his own research and encouraging an exploration into the value of diet, that he chose cardiovascular disease. And he said, I could have chosen cancer. Both of them are big problems. Cardiovascular disease is the bigger problem. It affects more people. But he says, it wasn't clear to me which was going to be the most promising. They both looked good, but I chose cardiovascular disease, and it turns out I'm glad I did, because it turns out that if you were coaching people on very strict diet with respect to cancer, you would have some degree of success, but it would not be anything like the success that you see in cardiovascular disease. So that's how we look at it. We look at it in cardiovascular disease, it's diet above all, and the doctor is a very, very distant second place. With respect to cancer, the oncology, you have to really look at what it is that they may have available. And you also, though, in other words, you look at these things more evenly. You're going to take a more serious, your cardiologist wants to put a stent in you, and he's rolling his eyes at the diet. That guy we're going to avoid that guy, and you're going to talk to one of our great doctors in the plant-based world, and you're going to start chewing your salad. Okay, that's how you're going to fix that. But when it comes to cancer, you have to have a more even-handed and open-minded approach towards medicine, because we do not have the checkmate solution in the plant-based community. All we have is an assist. Okay, very
Great.
good.
Thank you. And what about fasting though? Sometimes for cancer, hasn't Dr. Goldhammer had some success with certain types of cancer?
Yes. So, but those are lymphomas, and it's not complete success. He's had intermittent. So he's had, some people have been successful, some people have not. The successes have been notable in the fact that they've been more successful than you would expect by chance, by quite a bit. And lymphomas are different than a lot of other cancers. Just the nature of their cellular structure makes them more amenable to something like fasting. And so I was talking to an oncologist at one point that I described this effect to her, and she told me, we talked for a good while, and she said, the more I think about it, it doesn't surprise me. When I really think through what you're saying and how this would all work, it doesn't surprise me that this might work with the lymphomas. That's going to be different with other tissue in the body that's cancerous. So there's things that we would expect it to work for, and things we would expect it probably not to work for. So the lymphomas would be particularly conducive, and anybody that has a lymphoma, that they're ought to look into that as an adjunct treatment.
Right. It's interesting that this question came up today, because just last night we saw a documentary that's going to be released soon called The Food Cure, where there were certain patients from as young as 6 months old to elderly that actually they were able to overcome their cancers with food. But I'm sure that's not everybody. So
right, exactly. I have no doubt that it improves your odds. but people need to not be, we don't want people ignoring either diagnostics or treatment when it may be actually really scientifically supportable. And so that's why Dr. McDougall said, hey, get a colonoscopy when you're after 50. Okay, so he looked at the evidence. I would actually go beyond that and say that I hate colonoscopy. I had it done once, only because a friend of mine had a very serious cancer scare with his colon, and I thought, you know what, let's not be too cavalier here. So I had I'll never do it again because the stuff that you have to swallow tastes like rat poison, and so I will never do that. However, you can use the tests that they have available that you can just use stool sample tests, and those things, if you do those every year, those are a better solution than a colonoscopy. And so you just let those you just have that keep track of something like that. Very, very simple, very, very cheap. That's a good way to monitor yourself for digestive cancers. Better though to just obviously the most important thing to do is just eat healthy. If you eat healthy, you're going to be reducing your odds a lot. However, keep track of it a little bit. When you're 50 or over, you ought to have an eyeball out for that one, because that's one that it looks like they can fix. Okay, so I'm not so interested in cancers that I know that they don't have any chance for, that they don't have any, that they have absolutely no way to treat. So if you have those situations, I'm not going to go monitoring myself for some cancer just because they know how to monitor it and that we're going to monitor it. And forget it. You don't have any choice to fix it anyway. But when there's cancers like skin cancer and colon cancer, those are two things that they have very good treatment odds on. And so as a result of that, those are things that you should be monitoring and try to take that risk out of your personal cancer equation.
Nice. It's funny, when they were showing what they were feeding the patients with cancer to recover, Charles and I were laughing. They're saying, well, that's just what we eat every day.
That's amazing. I'm glad to hear that somebody did such a documentary. I'll have to look at that. That's great, AJ.
Okay. Yeah, I hope to have the filmmaker on very soon, because I think it's being released in the next couple of weeks. Yeah. So this person asked to remain anonymous, and it's interesting because I think this might be a rare disorder, but I actually knew somebody when I was 19 that had it. Can you please ask Dr. Lisle to speak on chewing and spitting disorder? It is killing someone very close to me.
Chewing and spitting disorder. I've known people that chewed their food and spit. I didn't know that they called it a disorder.
Well, I think it's a form of anorexia, because the person I knew that had it was one of the first males that had anorexia, and he would eat a lot of food, but he was anorexic because he never swallowed the food.
Right. And so what the person is doing is that this is it's just an anorexia, and so it's just a particular pattern of behavior. So many anorexics might weigh and measure their food within a gram. They might do that. They might get 25,000 steps a day in. That may be another thing that they do. And another thing that they'll do is chew and spit. Okay, so so what they're doing is they're feeling like they didn't really eat the food, but they're surviving on the fact that as you chew and you do some swallowing, you're getting some calories. And so a lot of times they'll chew up relatively high calorie density foods, maybe peanut chocolate bars and things like that. And so in doing so, they'll have very little fibrous material that they'll swallow, but they're essentially on a concentrated caloric liquid diet. That's kind of what it is that they're doing. So it's, you could say it's killing the person, but it probably isn't. In other words, they've probably been doing it for years, and they continue to survive and struggle along. It's obviously a severe anorexia case. Anorexia is what anorexia is, folks, is it's obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's almost always in women. It's not entirely, but it's almost always, and that's because what this is this obsessive fear over getting fat. And so, and what that is that's a what you're looking at is extreme hyperconscientiousness with respect to a threat to the person's status. And so what you'll find hyperconscientious people do is they do unusual risk mitigating behaviors. So for example, if they're worried about germs, they'll wash their hands 50 times a day. If they're worried about their house getting broken into, they'll check the locks 50 times. If they're worried about the house burning down, they'll check the stove 50 times. All you're looking at is reasonable behavior, except it's being taken to extremes. And so that's what it is. And it's a derivative of a hyperconscientious nervous system. Not easy to treat. They say that SSRIs help, but I don't believe it. Um, I would never trust psychopharm really with anything. The best treatment is going to be CBT type treatments. Those are never going to fix the problem. They will only occasionally, they will have the person mute it down for periods. So someone who is anorexic is essentially their nervous system is not disordered. They're just hyperconscientious. So we wouldn't call someone who's 7 foot tall disordered. We would just call them extremely tall. We don't call someone who is hyperconscientious, disordered. We just say that, wow, you're out there on the extreme. We can call your behavior a disorder if we want, because we can say, hey, it's clearly, a lousy cost-benefit analysis for your life. So if you're washing your hands 50 times a day, you're wasting a lot of time and energy, and you've got a lot of anxiety, and that's what's going on there. However, and so what you can sometimes do is by a treatment process, the person can maybe wash their hands 10 times a day instead of 60, and things are better. They can check the stove 4 or 5 times rather than 50 times. So you can mute it down, but you will never get rid of the underlying issue, because the underlying issue, there isn't a disease, there isn't a disorder. All there is a place on a bell curve that individual happens to sit. So our chewer and spitter is just, this isn't chewing and spit disorder, they can call it that, but all it is anorexia, okay? And the anorexia can kill people. In other words, your hyperconscientiousness, you can imagine, in principle, if you, anorexia is a bit of a unique OCD variant, and it's a very unfortunate one in the sense that you can rub your hands raw, but it's not likely to kill you. Okay, and you can check your stove 1,000,000 times, and that's not going to kill you either. But anorexia is a particular OCD variant that could, and it doesn't usually. In other words, it's rare to have an anorexic death, but they happen. And so what would I tell the person? I would tell the person, hey, your best odds is to get a very kind, stable CBT therapist, to make a connection with that therapist, someone who's extremely patient and not pushy. If you have an impatient psychotherapist with anorexia, you're going to have a turbulent situation that's not going to be in that patient's best interest, okay? And the reason why that's true is that anorexia is going to test the patience of any therapist. You have to understand that you're dealing with essentially an OCD condition that is never going to go away. All we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out strategies to help you mute it. The great fear that anorexia is trying to defend itself against is fat. So and so that's why they do what they do. They'll restrict like crazy. They'll exercise like crazy. They will eat very low calorie density foods if they get that figured out. Some of them may do a variant of eating and vomiting. That's bulimia. We act like it's a different thing, but it's not. It's all the same thing. It's all exactly the same process that's going on. The fear that the person is feeling is legitimate, just like there's a legitimate fear of germs and a legitimate fear of burning your house down and a legitimate fear of leaving your door unlocked. There's a legitimate fear of getting fat. So the anorexic looks around in 21st century America and sees the enormous physical and psychological price that women pay for being overweight. The prejudice, the the reduction of attractiveness, the reduction of romantic options, the reduction of even business and professional and friendship status. All of these things are very significant prices that both men and women pay, but women pay more, and that's because women's shape has been an important evolutionary cue as to her fertility, i.e., whether or not she's pregnant. So when women are overweight, they look pregnant. When they look pregnant, they are uninteresting, generally to males. Not always, but in other words, in general, there's a much muted interest. That reduction of status is very discernible in interactions that you have with other people. And so that is the anorexic, being a hyper conscientious individual, is determined to not have those losses take place for them. And so as a result, that hyperconscientiousness gets translated into one of the more bizarre, extreme OCD variants that you're ever going to see, and the most dangerous, I believe. So yes, it's not likely killing this friend, but it is certainly compromising their health. It may eventually, an anorexia person might die at 72 instead of 82 because of general systems failure at some point behind long-term chronic deprivation, but they're generally not dying at 45, and they're generally not dying at 55. They're actually not generally dying at 72. But so it's probably not killing the person. It might be. If their weight is so low, then we know what has to be done. They have to go inpatient, and they have to be force-fed through a feeding tube. Okay, so if that's not where they are, then our job is to get them to a very kind, extremely stable, non-psychodynamic therapist. The last thing we need, the last thing that an anorexic needs, is to have a psychodynamic BS being put at them as they look back through their childhood relationships with their parents, and we see a pattern of a child that is desperate for control because there's this or that issue. This is nonsense. It has nothing to do with it. And yet many patients have to suffer through, and their parents have to suffer through, a cross-examination and an aura of suspicion that there's been some kind of an abuse process or some kind of untoward psychological dynamic processes in the home which has led to this. It isn't. Okay, this is a misunderstanding and a legacy of Freud. The issue is natural personality variation. That's what it is. And for the psychologists in the world that don't understand that natural personality variation is genetic, that they believe it's acquired through learning experiences, you can then see why they would look back down through childhood issues, trying to figure out, why did this child become such a control freak? Okay, it must be that somehow they didn't have control in their home, so this is a compensation. The things that the Freudian and psychodynamic and New Age trauma people think is superficially plausible. In other words, it seems to make some kind of sense, but it's just wrong. It's just not true. It's just like a false understanding of that the moon is made out of basalt as opposed to something else. It's just a mistake. And so it's a mistake that is very uncomfortable and unpleasant and unproductive when you take that mistake into a therapy room with an anorexic. Okay, so that's why we want a CBT person that doesn't have that kind of stuff rattling around in their head. Very patient, essentially trying to guide the individual towards running little experiments against their worst case scenario fears and seeing whether or not the data from these experiments will actually help improve the situation. That's precisely what we do with hand washers. We get them to run short-term experiments to find out whether or not they actually are going to die of Ebola if they touch a doorknob. Okay, and so sometimes when they find out they didn't die of Ebola, they essentially can improve to modest degrees. That's about it, Jay.
Well, just to read a nice comment from Dr. Daryl Woodruff, who's watching live. He says, Doug is the best of the best. I couldn't agree more. And when you were describing the therapist who is patient and runs experiments, it kind of reminded me of you.
Yeah, in other words, what I do, first of all, you said Dr. Woodruff, I just love that guy. It's great. Running experiments is absolutely a concept that I've adopted from CBT. I was trained as a CBT therapist. Actually, what I do is fundamentally CBT. It just doesn't look like the CBT that other people see. And that's because CBT has no underlying theory of motivation at all. It just doesn't. It's just sort of a vague set of concepts that CBT therapists have noticed from the 1950s on, that people seem to have distorted views of the world and themselves, and that CBT therapists tries to attempt to get people to challenge those. But CBT therapists don't know, for example, and don't think of the world in terms of survival and reproductive problems. So they don't think of the world in terms of competitive problems in mating, friendship, trade, and then in family dynamics. They aren't seeing the world through biology. And so essentially what it is that I do, and now Dr. Hawk with me, what we do is we are translating CBT general concepts and informing CBT with this more biologically accurate understanding of human life and its processes. And when we do that, we wind up with hopefully something that's better.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting you said about anorexia being OCD, because I've known quite a few, and some of them were overweight or obese, but some of them that I've met never started out overweight. You know what I mean?
Right. They just have the OCD chip.
Interesting.
So yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You see a lot of it in the entertainment industry.
Yes, of course you would. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, this is kind of a fun question from Keith. If the purpose of life is survival and reproduction, why do people bother having sex when they're no longer able to reproduce? Other species that have been spayed or neutered or are past a reproductive age do not have sex. So why do humans keep doing it?
Yeah, there's first of all, men never are unproductive potentially. So we can take 50% of the question and put it to the side, because men could always reproduce. So now we're only talking about women. So women have an unusual thing in nature where there's a long period of time when they can't have children towards the end of their lives. Now, that being the case, we see why that would be. We can hypothesize why that took place in human natural history. It would be because if a woman's potential lifespan might have been 70 to 80, which it undoubtedly, of course, was. But by age 46, she would have had her last child probably. So the question is, what do we do in the last 30 years? Well, first of all, one thing that we're doing for the last 30 years is that we're raising the last child. So let's suppose the last child you had at 42, might have been very typical. So let's say we go 42, and now that kid is in real hot water for needing a great deal of attention for 12, 14 years. So we can see that she still needs to be alive and well for the next 14 up into her mid 50s. So now we're going to see that it doesn't make sense for her to be fertile past 42, but it makes sense for her to be sexually interested past 42, because a big part of being a female, sorry to say, is to try to get resources out of males. And so the way we get resources out of males is through female sexuality. So the male doesn't know when you have lost, when your last viable egg has passed. He's just looking at you and looking at your wrinkles and looking at your shape, and he's trying to figure it out. And the thing is if you can bluff him, in other words, if you can be concerned about your appearance and use cosmetics and try to do your hair fancy and try to, etc., have nice fashion, all of which would have happened in ancient times. That what would have happened is, and if you maintain sexual interest after you are no longer fertile for a period of time, that would be the possibility of bluffing that mate into sticking around, continuing to have sex with you, unconsciously thinking he still might impregnate you, while he helps raise the last child that you had together. Okay, so now we can see why there would be interest, at least for that period of time. Now, after that period of time, the same kinds of motivations would still exist, but they would probably be muted, and that's exactly what we see. So we see that female sexual interest drops off pretty substantially between 55 and 80. It's not that it goes away to zero. The machinery is still there. There's still some degree of motivation, but it's not nearly what it would have been at 35 for obvious reasons. It could also be the case, and we don't know why. It could be the case that they are still attempting to possibly get provisioned, possibly provision for their adult children from that same male or mate. So you can see reasons why female sexuality could linger in a muted fashion into late life, and it does. However, you will also see that if you were to survey people at 60 years old, males and females, you will find that males are far more interested in sexual activity at 60 than females are. Okay, so that is true, and of course that makes perfect biological sense because the survival and reproductive cost-benefit analysis for sex at that point is quite a bit different for the female versus the male. The male is absolutely still viable. The female no longer is, and so therefore we would expect her sexual interest to be muted and sort of strategic, okay? And so if you think about this from a game theory perspective, which is what my friends in theoretical biology do all day long, they model these things on computers and try to figure out all kinds of things about human and animal nature. If you think about this, the male, and not talking about humans, I'm talking about male in nature versus female in nature, you would expect that the male in nature is designed by nature to attempt to try to get sexual activity for as little cost as possible. And you would expect that the female is trying to essentially allow sex to happen for the highest possible payoff. This is exactly what these two things are. The mathematical game theory behind this dynamic is perfectly understandable. It is precisely the relationship that you have with your insurance company. Your insurance company wants you to pay the highest possible premium and pay out the least possible claims. They have a whole claims department that is all going to snarl at you, and they have investigators to try to find out whether or not you're trying to cheat them. They're keeping track of people who have cheated before or have had suspect claims histories. In other words, they are in conflict of interest with you. That doesn't mean that you can't do business. You do business. State Farm has a whole bunch of my money and I've never filed a claim, okay? I've been driving for 4+ decades. I've owned many cars. I've provisioned quasi-stepchildren in their cars and paid all kinds of State Farm bills for half a century. And that I haven't gotten a nickel out of those people. That doesn't mean it hasn't been worth it, okay? So the male-female dynamic is one of essentially a deep biological economics process, and so that same process just changes its form as you age. It wouldn't mean that the female would say, oh, well, gee, I'm never going to have a sexual thought on my head, and I couldn't care less, and I don't want anything to do with it. Nope, we would expect, we would expect that it would still be there in the engine because it might be useful. Now, I want to make another point, AJ, just for entertainment, to try to just share some additional perspectives with our people, that ways of things that I might not have said things before. In order to understand human psychology, you have to understand that there's two giant parts, and I think of them as the Earth and the Moon. So the Earth is the general principles that guide all people. The Moon is personality differences or individual differences. So the Earth would be like your doctor studying the kidney, and everybody's kidney works the same. It has nephron cells, they filter sodium. It was everybody's kidney in one way works the same, and it's super complicated to figure that out, okay? Once you figure that out, within that, then you can be a nephrologist, or what do they call those folks, that you study individual differences. The individual differences are not complicated relative to the general processes. The general processes are extremely complicated. The individual differences wind up being little variations on the general processes. So figuring out nephron cells and how they work and how they filter the blood was unbelievably complicated. Figuring out that some people have more nephron cells, some people have less, that's pretty easy. And that tells us the story of a lot of the story of high blood pressure and kidney malfunction. Okay. So these are two things. The earth is general psychology, the moon is individual differences. You can't understand the whole dance of human nature or life unless you understand that there are both. Okay. They work together, they're interrelated. So when this question about sexuality comes up, you have to understand there's a lot of women that are 65 that are super sexually interested and red hot. Those exist in the world. They're just not as common as the men would be, because the general psychological principles of those dynamics are going to hold throughout the species. The individual differences, we can't understand what we see without understanding that those are true. I have met both men and women who have almost or no sexual interest in life at all. It's just simply sort of not in their engine. And yet I've met more women where that was true than men. Okay, I have met both, but I would say it's 3 to 5 times more often that that description of life will come out of a woman. That makes sense. Okay, that makes sense because of the underlying game theory that builds the whole system in the first place. Women should be, in principle, defending the eggs and defending their sexuality and trying to optimize resource flow as a result of each sex act. The males should be far more active, far more opportunistic, and attempting to get as much as they can for as little effort as possible. That's how it basically works. And then we throw individual differences on top of that. We draw age processes on top of that, and we get the whole story. There.
That is fascinating. You know, I used to be about 20 years ago an activity director at a retirement home, and it was amazing how sexual everybody was. And if there wasn't a suitable partner of the opposite sex, they went with what they could find. So,
right.
You know what they say, if you can't be with the one you love, right? Love the one you're with. So very good. So, okay. This is from Randy. Dr. Lisle, I believe I've heard you say, or perhaps it was Dr. Goldhammer, that the more concentrated the calories, the more dopamine is released in the brain. Who figured this out, when, and how? If this is true, then I don't understand why people aren't just drinking pure oil, as it's the most concentrated source of calories. If you eat enough calories from whole natural food, can you still get as much dopamine as you would from calorically dense processed foods or high-fat plant foods? And are there any other ways to get dopamine that won't make us fat?
Okay, a whole bunch of questions though. So one of the sort of great discoveries in neuroscience was finding out that dopamine was this huge chemical signaling mechanism for what we're going to call reward. In other words, the creatures designed by nature to move around in order to get critical resources for survival and reproduction. And it needs a signaling device to tell it when it's been successful, and it needs other signaling devices to tell it when it's been unsuccessful. So if you bump into something and it feels good, then it's probably good for your survival and reproduction. If it turns out that it feels bad, it's probably bad for it. And there needs to be a signaling mechanism to tell you that. So if your skin rubs into a rose bush and you feel the thorns, you should feel a little anxiety and avoidance reaction coming. In other words, it's instantaneously processed in the brain. It's done through the use of neurotransmitters. So there's an activation of circuits that takes place as a result of you feeling that pinprick from the rose bush. If a masseuse takes his or her, I guess, hands and sort of starts to massage you and it smooths out of your skin, you may like that feeling, probably because that feeling is mimicking, the tenderness of sexual activity, or your mother soothing you, etc. In other words, it's a signaling process that actually indicates safety or attraction. So in other words, there's So and that is going to take place through a neurochemical cascade that's going to it's going to be activated as a result of that specific stimulus. Now, so one of the great discoveries was that dopamine, and there's other reward chemicals as well, but there's a major place in the brain called the dopamine pathway, and that when, in particularly, food or sex hits the organism, the dopamine system becomes more active. That makes sense, and so it causes a different kinds of pleasant feelings depending upon what's happening. So you don't feel the same way when you're having sex as you do when you're eating chocolate. Okay, it's a different. Those are different sensory processes, but they both result in dopamine being flooded. So in other words, that's a way that the brain is basically helping organize its memory systems and basically say, hey, we were in that location under those circumstances and we got a reward. We had something happen that increased our survival or reproductive capabilities. And so that actually helps the organism map and remember where there were resources in the environment under what circumstances. Okay, so that's how this works. Now, obviously, if there's a little bit of a reward, there's going to be a little bit of dopamine. If there's a little more reward, there's going to be a little bit more dopamine. And if there's going to be a huge reward, there's going to be a huge dopamine. So that's exactly how that should work, and that is how that does work. Now, God knows who figured it out. I mean, there's been a huge amount of animal experiments looking at these things for 30 years. This is how they figured out drug addiction. They found out that the drugs were hyperactivating these pathways. So they found out that cocaine was hyperactivating the dopamine pathway. They found out that the opiates were hyperactivating the endorphins pathways. So it was as if you had a big endorphin process take place naturally. Big endorphin processes take place naturally, for example, at orgasm. So orgasm, I don't think is a dopamine cascade. I believe that's an endorphin cascade. So that gives you that relaxed euphoria afterwards. That's another type of experience that it educates the organism that it was in a good space for some survival reproductive benefit. In that case, it's reproductive. You'll also get an endorphin cascade as you digest food. So the digestion of food also is telling you that's good. Remember where we were and what we ate and how it was, etc. Because we need to remember that because we just increased our likelihood of survival as a result of doing this. So of course it's going to be the case that the more concentrated the food, the more valuable it is for your survival, and therefore the bigger hit that the systems are going to take, and the more activation of those pathways. Now, the question is, why wouldn't you just drink bottles of oil, which would make sense? The answer is that the sensory systems are built in such a way is to sort of maximize their action when you are mimicking the limits of the organism's natural history, what it would have come into contact with. Past that point, it's actually such a hyperactivation, it's not even pleasant. So you can imagine, so for example, the hyper, you could take a stimulus device, for example, for sexuality and hyper stimulate sexual tissues, and it's painful or it's overwhelming and it's unpleasant, okay? But you could also see that if you increase that stimulation above what you might normally get, well, now we're in really a sweet spot that what we might call a bliss point. So this is precisely what has happened in the food industries. So the food industry has looked very carefully by using a bunch of people as test subjects to look for the place where the food is seasoned and concentrated to a level that optimizes the dopamine and endorphin responses, i.e. the bliss point. Now the bliss isn't a point, it's an area of typical stimulation for the average person. So a Frito is pretty well at the human bliss point for salt and fat. and the crunching sensation. A lot of chocolates are pretty close to the bliss point. The C's candy is getting really close to the bliss point. Now notice the candies are different and there's individual differences and preferences there. But they pretty well over the years been able to triangulate on how to maximize the bliss point, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, etc. Now, when you get past that, if they added a bunch of oil to Ben & Jerry's ice cream, it would now take us too far. It's too hyperstimulating. It's like your rock music that you love it at 103 decibels, but at 107 your ears hurt. And you literally know it's no longer exciting, okay? So that's the answer to the question, that you're only built, the sensory systems are built for a maximum load that they can take. If you go past that maximum load, it's not interesting. Okay, it's actually avoidant and disgusting, or you will pull away from it. Okay, so that's how that works. I forget the guy. That person had a whole bunch of other questions, but that was
okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. So here is one from Barb. I've heard you say before you eat something unhealthy to eat something healthy first.
Yeah.
But if you do that, won't you ultimately be taking in more calories by eating both the healthy food and then the unhealthy food?
Oh, no. This is really good thinking, but this is not understanding that your caloric intake is, it isn't a day-to-day thing, it's a year-to-year thing. So you have to think about your caloric intake not on a specified length of time, but understanding that it's a continuum, that we could in principle chop it up by the day, but that would be a mistake because your body actually isn't acting on it on a day-to-day basis. It's a more continuous process. So if you eat a tremendous amount today, you will eat less tomorrow. You don't start out the new day with a whiteboard that erases everything and says, well, now we start from scratch. That is not how it happens. You maintain greater storages overnight as a result of the food that you ate yesterday, and that influences your hunger drive today. So we don't think in terms of oh, how much did I eat today? And oh, I eat a lot of good food, but I ate too much good food. No, that's a mistaken understanding of the process. So what you need to do is you need to understand that the only way that an animal will systematically overeat, in other words, how if we look at the animal's behavior over, say, a month, what will cause an animal to overeat? And it will not be, even if I force-fed an animal whole natural foods. Let's suppose I did that through some bizarre device, okay? If I did that, and then I quit force-feeding them, obviously, so I didn't continue, I could, in principle, continue to force-feed an animal, which is just a disgusting thing to even think about. But let's suppose that I force-fed my pet hamster more than he or she wanted to eat today by 10 or 20 calories. They didn't really want to eat it. They couldn't be induced into it, but I forced it. Okay, now, let's suppose I did that. What would happen is that that same hamster would eat 20 calories less over the next couple of days. In other words, their system would be finding an equilibrium. This is exactly the same way. You can hold your breath if you want, but you'll catch up in the next minute, okay? Or if you hyperventilate, then what's going to, if you take a bunch of big, deep breaths right in a row, then what's going to happen is that you're going to breathe less over the succeeding 45 seconds as you essentially, the system comes back down to homeostasis. Okay, so if you, so I consider any healthy thing that you eat, it's not on the unusually rich food that would have been a rare continuum. In other words, honey is something that people ate that was natural. Meat was something that they ate that was natural. Nuts were something that they ate that was natural. Those are three natural rich foods, but they would have been limited, okay? So people would have got what they could get out of them, but they wouldn't have been a lot of calories. So they would have drifted the average calorie density of the diet a bit higher, but the people wouldn't have been in a position very often to get large amounts of those. So let's suppose, for example, that we are talking about some intermediate concentrated food like rice. Okay? the any rice or an apple. If I eat an apple right now, and then I have a defined dish that the cook makes, and it's exactly the same amount of calories every day at lunch. But I eat an apple before lunch, and I'm conscientious enough that I'm intimidated enough by what the cook thinks that by God I eat that 600 calorie tostada lunch, even though I will find that I'm not interested in eating the last bit of it. Why? Because that might be a normal satiation process for me on an empty stomach, but I don't have an empty stomach because I just ate a 150 calorie apple. Okay, but let's suppose I cram it in. So now I've got 750 calories in there over this last hour, where normally it would be 6, and in fact 6 was satiation, but I ate past satiation. Now what happens? Have I now eaten more calories? No, I haven't. What's going to happen is that those 150 calories, I will eat 150 less calories over the succeeding 24 hours. In other words, as we look at it as a continuum, it's going to be in balance. So every bit of healthy, reasonable, calorie-dense food that you eat is a victory, because it's displacing or making you less hungry for any of the crap that you eat. So the notion that, well, if I'm going to eat crap, what I have to do is not eat the other food because then I will have eaten less calories is a mistake. Okay, that you are thinking that that's making sense because it seems to be making sense today over a 4-hour period. But the truth is, today over a 4-hour period means absolutely nothing, because there is no such thing as a 4-hour period. The entire hunger drive in your behavior pattern over the next several days is a dynamic that will be influenced by what you do in the next 4 hours. It's not a truncated open and shut case there that we then start over. So if you eat healthy food, before you eat the junk food, the whole point here is you're likely to eat less of the junk food because we've displaced a lot of your hunger. And we've displaced it with food that was appropriate to the organism. So that's the goal here. In other words, if you were going to eat a pint of Ben and Jerry's vegan ice cream, but instead you ate half a pint, then even though we may have eaten more calories because we ate, I don't know, a big plate full of potatoes and then we ate a half a pint, you're actually better off than had you eaten the full pint. Because if you ate the full pint, that's not that much stretch reception. So therefore, 3 hours later, we're going to be back eating something else. And now, when we look at the whole situation, we eat a pint of that stuff instead of half a pint. Okay? Why did we eat half a pint? Because that hit satiation after we'd eaten a bunch of food that wasn't as rich that was appropriate. So the notion here is, forget about trying to think about it this very short term. Think about it year by year. Over the next year, how is it that we can minimize how much of any artificially rich food that you eat? The answer to that question is, don't start eating that stuff when you're hungry. If you start eating that stuff when you're hungry, you're going to eat an awful lot more of it than if you start eating any of that stuff when you're already full. Okay? So the game here is, as we look at the problem, we look at it over a long period of time, and over the long period of time, we are vastly better off. If you're ever going to get into anything junky, eat something healthy first, because we will displace how much of the junk that you're eating. It's how much junk you're eating is the problem, not how much food you're eating.
Well, thank you. So this question, I know you've answered in our private group. Guys, if you're ever interested in Feel Fabulous, you can have 2 weeks for free. Dr. Lisle does a Q&A every month, and I know you've answered it there, but I don't think you've answered it to a wide audience. And Lynn says, I've heard Dr. Lisle say that not everyone needs to do an A+ diet to achieve their goals, and that a B diet might be just fine. Well, I agree with him because I've resolved all my medical issues and lost a large amount of weight on a B diet. I still have 30 pounds to go. Have you seen many people completely achieve their weight loss goals while doing a B diet instead of an A diet?
Oh, yes, many. Okay, so that's within the bell curve of the human genotype. Okay, so when you look out at the world, folks, you're going to see a lot of young people that are thin. But when you start seeing people that are 40 and 50, you're going to see less of those people, but they're there. Okay, if you just go to the mall and look around, you're going to see quite a number of 40-year-old men and women are thin. So let's just talk about the women for the moment, because we're not generally looking at the men too carefully. Why? Because people don't care as much about them, uh, about their shape. So the thing is that of 40-year-old women, we're probably going to find that 15% of them are thin. Okay, so that's genetic. Those people didn't earn that; they're just born that way. Now, so now it's going to turn out that if we take a bunch of people of the remaining 85% that have weight problems, and we take we take a few of those people from the whole spectrum of the other 85%, and we start feeding them, say, a B level diet. In other words, a huge improvement over what it is that they're doing. So now, instead of being a conventional eater, which causes the average female to gain 2 pounds a year between her 16th and her 36th birthday. It's the average American female is 40 pounds overweight by her 36th birthday. Now, if we take said person, average person, and we start feeding them a healthy diet, there's going to be more than, in other words, now we're not going to have just the 15% thin people, we're going to have some more. How many more? Well, I'd have to eyeball it, but probably another 10 or 15% of people that have weight problems would probably reach ideal weight, and it was excellent ideal weight, on doing a B diet. And probably 75 to 85% wouldn't. Okay. And that's where this person is. So this person has the genes that caused her to eliminate, she got rid of a bunch of health problems, which is great. She definitely made significant dietary changes, had all kinds of success, lost however much weight that she lost, but now she's stopped at being, 20% overweight, probably is what it is. And so that means that her diet is probably still about 20% too rich. So she's probably at, 750 calories a pound instead of 600 calories a pound. And she's not sweating it, which is fine. But probably she, if she goes to B plus, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if she'll go from 30 pounds overweight to 0. Don't know. Probably not. If a B diet got you to 30, probably a B plus diet gets you to 22, and an A minus diet gets you to 15, and an A diet might get you all the way to 0. So that's probably what it is. If you have done a B diet legitimately and you're 80 pounds overweight, you're going to have to get an A plus diet probably to get down to 10 pounds more than you want. Okay, that's genes. So genetic variation is a huge factor in this equation that is rarely talked about by anybody but me and Jen Hawk. Okay?
Right.
But this is true.
Well, all I can tell you, Dr. Lisle, is when it comes to certain things, genes suck.
Genes suck with certain things. There's no question about that.
Other things I like them for. It's interesting because when you spoke to Feel Fabulous last month, you reframed it in a way that when people are at a plateau, you actually called it a behavioral equilibrium, which I thought was fascinating instead of a plateau.
That's so good, HA. And this is something that, this is one of these little things that rattles around in my mind, and I wish I could get clearer to everybody. There is no such thing as a plateau. People have all kinds of magical thinking about this, like, well, I lost 50 pounds and then I hit a plateau and I'm still 50 pounds overweight. I just somehow my body stopped losing weight. No, that isn't what happened. What happened is that dietary change that you made. Let's suppose that you should be 150 pounds and you are 200 pounds, but you were 250 pounds. And so you went from a standard American diet to a B diet. And over the course of 6 months, you dropped 50 pounds. That's not an uncommon result from a very significant dietary change, a major improvement, a real commitment to healthy living. But it was a B level. Okay, so that's what a lot of people can and will do. And so now we get there and it stops. And the person's a little mystified. They're like, wow, I'm doing the same thing I've been doing for the last 6 months, but the weight loss stopped. Okay. Well, if you talk to Dr. Phil, he thinks that you've hit a plateau, or any other uneducated person like this. No, you haven't hit a plateau. Your behavior and your body finally hit an equilibrium. Okay, so as soon as you started to make the dietary change at 250 pounds, 250 pounds was being maintained by a certain calorie density diet and lifestyle. Let's suppose that you were at 1,000 calories a pound. So now you started to include a bunch of healthy food, but you're still having some rich food, but now you're at 800 calories a pound. So as a result of that, you started shedding weight. But you don't shed all of the weight that you're going to shed in 3 days, do you? You're like, well, of course not. Diet takes some time. Well, how much time? The answer is it takes the amount of time necessary for your body weight to reach an equilibrium with what your behavior would dictate. And I can never know what that point is, but we'll find it. So if you, with the one woman that I remember her numbers from my outpatient practice, she was at 336 pounds. She started to eat oatmeal and she went to about 260. So then it stopped. And I'm like, well, why don't we give up the pizza and the ice cream for dinner? Oh no, I don't want to do that. Well, she had reached her equilibrium. And then that's as far as that dietary change is going to take place, because at an 800 calorie a pound diet, that individual is going to be X amount overweight. So let's suppose that 800 calorie a pound diet is going to take that person from 250 slowly or quickly down to 200, and that's going to stop, because that's where that genotype is going to land at 800 calories a pound. Okay, it hasn't reached a plateau. If we now shift that diet to 900 calories a pound, what's going to happen? Back up to 225. Okay, what if we shift it to 850? Oh, it's at 215. What if we shift it to 750? Oh, now it's going to lose weight down past 200. It's going to be at 187. Okay. Well, what if we go to 700? Well, then it's going to go to 175 or 172. Well, what if we go to 650? Well, then it's going to head down to 165 pounds. Well, what if we go to 550? Oh, well, then it arrives at 150. Okay. Your weight is just a result of your behavioral equilibrium. Okay. So it's not that your body has reached some resistance point. I'll hear this magical thinking like, well, my body just seems to want to be. Body doesn't seem to want to be anything. Your body morphology is just a derivative of your genes and then the behavior that you put on it. It doesn't want to do. It doesn't defend extra weight. It doesn't do anything of the kind. Okay. That's just magical, wacky thinking. No, it's your behavior reaches equilibrium. Okay. That equilibrium will dictate your body morphology. So if you change the behavior, suddenly we are out of equilibrium and we don't know where it's going to stop. So that's why, when AJ went on her journey many years ago, I had no idea where it was going to stop. I knew it would stop somewhere. She's not going to wind up at 90 pounds. Okay. I had no, she's 5'6" or 5'7", not going to be 90 pounds. I don't know where it's going to stop. But I was pretty sure with what she's doing, it wasn't going to stop at 160 pounds. Like, no, that doesn't make any sense biologically. The body is still going to genetically going to be engineered to keep shedding weight to get you down to an optimum for your health. That's where it's going. As some people say, well, my optimum health is 5'4" and 135 apparently because I'm doing everything perfectly, but I've got more fat on me than I want. Well, too bad. It's genes. Okay, 5'4", 135 may not be aesthetically ideal for you or modern media environment, etc., but it may be actually a health optimum for your biology. That could be true. I've seen people where that was true. I've seen people that were 5'5", 145 and looked great. Absolutely great. Okay. Those are, they're just, strong, solid, curvy, whatever it is. It's like, hey, that's it. Sorry. You might want to be 135, but your biology and your genes are telling you that on an outstanding diet, sorry, you're 145. That's just how it is. So you will eventually reach an ideal equilibrium. Yes. All right.
Dana says, I love this man so much. Dr. Lisle, how Dr. McDougall often says it's the food, and he actually sells t-shirts that says that. Do you want me to get you one that says it's the genes?
Well, the problem with that is that can be so easily misunderstood, and a guy like Dr. McDougall might actually take offense at that. Because in other words, we're trying to explain, obviously, that environmental inputs, i.e. it's the food, is what we can do, okay? The added thing that I'm trying to say is the genes limit it. You know what I mean? The genes are dictating how this game winds up playing out. But sometimes but an overly simplistic view of it's the genes would cause it to act like I think your life is genetically determined, which of course it's not. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that your life has genetic constraints. And so so in other words, what I'm trying to tell you in the long short, AJ, it's a cute idea, but I think it's laden with trouble. So we'll skip. We'll pass on.
Okay. Okay. Well, people are really appreciating this, and they're saying they love you so much and they learn so much from you. And we are so blessed that you are coming back next month. It's already been scheduled, this time with Dr. Hawk on Sunday, September 13th. So thank you so much, Dr. Lisle. It was really wonderful talking to you.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me, AJ.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, guys, come back at 2 p.m. I have another show today with someone you don't know. She is as smart as she is beautiful. She is a plant-based gastroenterologist who you don't know yet, but you will. Her name is Dr. Janice Lassner, and she's going to be talking about some amazing topics. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, folks.